Welcome to another edition of Types and Figures here on eBible Fellowship. In a previous segment, we were looking at Adam, who, as you know, was the first man and a type of Christ. And today, we're going to take a look at Eve, the first woman and Adam's wife. So first, we're going to turn to Genesis chapter 2, where we read how God made Eve. In Genesis 2, verse 21 and 22, we read, "And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, made he a woman, and brought her unto the man." Now, we know that God hides truth throughout the Scriptures, and the Bible student must look carefully at every word to see how it's used elsewhere. And in Genesis 2, verse 22, we have a very interesting word, and this is the Hebrew word that is translated as made. Matter of fact, it is not the same word for made used in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 up to this point. It is a word that's used over 300 times in the Old Testament, and it's almost always translated as build or built or building. For example, we can see this describing the house of God in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. There we read, "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." And then it says in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 2, "And the house which King Solomon built for the Lord." This word, translated built, is used again and again to describe the building of the temple, the house of God. And we previously learned that the construction of the temple typified God building his eternal church, which consists of everyone he had saved. And this truth is further confirmed if we turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5 in the New Testament. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5 reads, "Ye also, as lively stones, are built up a spiritual house, and holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ." It also says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 9, "For we are laborers together with God, ye are God's husbandry, ye are God's building." Now, at this point, we have to think about that verse we read in Genesis 2, verse 22. "And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, made he a woman," and that word made was translated as build or built or building. So why does God tell us that he built Eve? Well, the answer is, just as with the temple, Eve is a picture of the body of believers, the bride of Christ, who are a spiritual house. And after Eve is formed, we read about Adam's reaction in Genesis 2, verse 23, where we read, "And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." Now, this is very similar to what we find in Ephesians 5, verse 30, which speaks of Christ and his elect. Ephesians 5, verse 30 reads, "For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones." So, just as Adam, who's a picture of Christ, calls Eve bone of his bones and flesh of his flesh, so too Christ calls all those he has saved members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. Eve, a type and figure of God's elect. You've been listening to Types and Figures on eBible Fellowship, and we hope you'll be able to join us next time for another edition.